It is time. Welcome to Fantasy Football Today, presented by the all-new Jeep Gladiator. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Pete Prisco. And Pete, we got hit with a bombshell right before the show started. Breaking news on Steelers quarterback Ben Roethlisberger done for the season. Your reaction to that is what?
And the Steelers are done for the season. I mean, look, when you have a quarterback of this magnitude, and there are only a handful of them in the league, when he goes down for the season, now, not a game or two, but for the season, your season is over. Look, I'm not saying Mason Rudolph can't do some good things, because he'll have his moments where he does. But this guy cures your ills, and now all those ills are going to be exposed because he's not around.
Here's a statement from Steelers coach Mike Tomlin on Roethlisberger's injury. He sustained a right elbow injury in the game against Seattle and was replaced by Mason Rudolph. So here's what Tomlin had to say. Ben Roethlisberger had an MRI on his right elbow Sunday evening, and it was determined by the Steelers medical team that surgery will be required. We expect that the surgery will be scheduled for this week. He will be placed on our reserve injured list and is out for the season. Those last few words ringing, I'm sure, in the ears of Steelers fans and of the Steelers players. And as we'll talk about here from a fantasy perspective, clearly it's going to impact JuJu Smith-Schuster, James Conner, who we were waiting to find out what his status is, dealing with the knee injury as well. Those are the two main guys, Vance McDonald, Dante Moncrief, for those of you that are relying on them. And then we'll talk about some quarterback replacements as we move throughout the show. But you see the Steelers pass catchers here. JuJu Smith-Schuster, the big one, he goes from, Pete, a clear-cut number one guy to a middle-of-the-road number two guy. He did not have a bad game with Mason Rudolph, but he did not have the typical stats that you were hoping for from JuJu, as we were hoping for to start the season. For more on this developing story with Ben Roethlisberger, we are now joined by our NFL insider for CBS Sports, Jason La Canfora. So, JLC, you've been following the story on Roethlisberger. How tough is this for the Steelers, and what are your expectations for Mason Rudolph stepping in?
I mean, it's a tough blow. I mean, let's be real about where the franchise is, right? Last year, by their standards, was an embarrassment. Everyone from the owner to GM Kevin Colbert doubled down on Ben Roethlisberger. They extricated themselves from Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell and guys who were clashing with the quarterback and clashing with the coach and clashing with the organization, and they put all their eggs in Ben's basket, and they thought that they had the potential to be basically as robust of an offense without those guys as with them. I mean, I talked to Kevin Colbert at length about it at Latrobe and during training camp, and he was adamant that, hey, we're not going to have one guy with 110 catches and 1,500 yards like AB, but we have 3 or 4 guys who we think will be a part of getting us close to that hole. And Ben's numbers aren't going to drop off dramatically. Well, they obviously are now because his season is over. And the early returns through 6 quarters of football were pretty ugly by anybody's standards. By whatever, Blake Bortles standards, they were ugly. Ben throwing to wide receivers in particular was horrible. 20 for 40, 204 yards, no TDs, 1 interception, a QB rating of 54.6. So we'll see. I can tell you they were much higher on Mason Rudolph than a lot of other teams. They were all in on him as being a potential heir apparent in that draft, and they have been very pleased with his development to this point, to the point that they traded Josh Dobbs, who they thought, had some upside a few weeks back because they didn't think he was going to get on the field and they could get a draft pick for him. And Rudolph was the guy who, if Ben wasn't going to be playing football anymore at some point late in 2020 or in 2021, they felt like Rudolph could be the guy. Now we're going to start finding out about that in real time. I would point out from a fantasy perspective, James Washington, who could get nothing going with Ben even in the preseason, even in practice, has clicked with Rudolph, and those two have a connection. I've seen it on the practice field. It showed up in preseason a little bit. They have a confidence in one another. He's the guy who I think if JuJu is now Batman, who becomes Robin, I think Washington has the best chance to be that guy. And we'll see if they throw the ball more downfield. It was a very limited showing in terms of the scope of that passing game through 6 quarters with Ben, and it did take off a little bit when Rudolph got in the huddle.
JLC, that's a great point on James Washington. He was a preseason star with Mason Rudolph, so that's a good nugget for those of you looking to maybe find a positive spin on this. Before we let you go, we want to ask you about the other big quarterback injury. Drew Brees dealing with the ligament damage in his thumb, going to be out for at least 6 weeks. What are you hearing about that, and what are they going to do to replace him?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see what Sean Payton says about this because the team is still being incredibly non-committal on any timeline. But like others, I've heard that Brees was advised by a specialist in L.A. that there was really no way around this procedure, and conservatively 6 weeks. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look at their schedule. He would not be back before that bye week. Now, does it take longer than 6 weeks? Considerably longer than 6 weeks? I would just say it's a thumb, it's his throwing hand. He's got to be able to grip the ball and rip the ball in order to play quarterback. So the best case scenario, based on what I hear right now, is him coming back right after their bye. Teddy Bridgewater is there for a reason. They traded for him a year ago when he was still even more of an unknown coming off that injury for a reason, because Sean Payton specifically believed of all the potential number 2 options out there, this was a guy who, if we lost Drew for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, it would not torpedo our season. And we could stay afloat, maybe win as many as we lose, and salvage a season if we lost our starter for something less than, 12 to 16 weeks. Well, they're in that exact scenario now. Taysom Hill is an intriguing prospect. He could see a little bit more of the field under center, some more interesting packages, maybe some direct snaps to Alvin Kamara. I think they'll probably get pretty creative with it, but the bottom line is Teddy Bridgewater is now the leader of that offense. He is their starting quarterback, at least through that bye week. And he'll have a lot of practice time with Sean Payton to get more focused and to, hopefully for his sake and the Saints' sake, look a little better than he did coming in cold this past weekend.
Jason, thanks so much for joining us. You're going to have, I'm sure, lots of time on CBS Sports HQ today, breaking down all of these injuries to Ben Roethlisberger and to Drew Brees. So thank you for taking a few minutes to join us here on Fantasy Football Today. So, Pete, you hear what JLC says about Drew Brees and the thumb injury, and then obviously Roethlisberger with the elbow injury. Let's go back to Brees real quick first, because it's going to get overshadowed a little bit with Ben being lost for the season. So how do the Saints sort of operate now with Teddy Bridgewater and Taysom Hill?
Well, like he mentioned, they're going to have to get more creative. I think the Taysom Hill phenomenon, and believe me, I've had many a conversation with Sean Payton about this. I don't get it, but you take Drew Brees off the field. But now that's okay, because you can take Teddy Bridgewater off the field and use Taysom Hill and all these special plays and formations and gimmicks and everything else. I think they're going to have to do a lot of that, because I don't know if Teddy Bridgewater is good enough, again, to overcome the issues on other parts of this team, including the defense, which hasn't played. It's been okay, but it hasn't been great. So for me, I think they got to get creative. And this is where Sean Payton's brilliance will come in. He will get creative. He's going to use Taysom Hill. He's going to split him out. He's going to run some. I bet he puts them in the backfield together at times and that kind of stuff. But I don't know with this schedule the way it is. You see that schedule. It's brutal, starting with Seattle this week, and it's going to be tough to move the football. And even though Seattle's defense hasn't been great, it's still going to be tough to move the football.
And then the schedule you mentioned, Seattle, Dallas, those are tough. Tampa Bay, not exactly the toughest opponent at home. But then Jacksonville, Chicago, if those defenses are playing like they're supposed to, it could be tough for the Saints offense.
So say he misses those 2, 4, 6 games, he's what? 2-4 maybe? They're 3. Best case scenario is 3-3 probably.
Well, I mean, best case scenario is 6-0, but that's not realistic.
Realistic best case scenario 3-3.
If you're looking at these situations, because again, we got to spin it forward fantasy-wise, the Steelers with Mason Rudolph and what that means for JuJu, and again, hopefully James Conner. We're keeping an eye on James Conner's knee injury. It's so funny that he's going to get overshadowed by this, and he may be the more prominent fantasy option, just given that he was a first-round pick. So looking at the Steelers players, specifically JuJu Smith-Schuster and the pass catchers, looking at the Saints guys, Michael Thomas and their receiving core, which receiver, let's just focus on JuJu and Michael Thomas. Which receiver do you feel more comfortable with moving forward?
Probably Michael Thomas. Because I think Teddy Bridgewater's been in the wars before. I mean, this is a guy that was a more than serviceable starting quarterback before he got hurt. He understands the passing game. He understands the NFL game. Mason Rudolph came off the bench. And we saw that with Gardner Minshew last week. You come off the bench, it's a different scenario. There's no pressure on you, just go play. Well, now he's starting. And not only is he starting, he's starting on the road, and they have tape on him. So I think it's tough. Teddy Bridgewater, to me, has been a quality quarterback at times in his career. He has starts on his resume, which Mason Rudolph doesn't. So I lean to Michael Thomas more than I lean to JuJu Smith-Schuster.
And obviously there's the implication of Brees coming back, whereas Ben is now going to be lost for the season. So you have a little bit more faith in Thomas. And Thomas
here's the other thing too, Jamie. How will they play? I don't think Sean Payton's going to change his philosophy because that's who he is. how will the Steelers play with a first-time starter at quarterback? That's the issue. Are they going to try and get, depending on what Connor is. If Connor's out, then what do you do? How do you get creative when you don't have your star runner in there? So do you get more restrictive? Do they take the ball out of Rudolph's hands and try and shorten the game? Where I don't think the Saints will do that. I don't think they're going to change who they are.
And the Saints, again, if you're just looking at the numbers, Thomas, 10 catches for 89 yards on 13 targets, the bulk of that coming with Bridgewater. So that's basically a Michael Thomas type of game. You don't want to see a little bit more than 9 yards per catch, but he's basically a high-volume receiver with not a big yards per catch type of guy, and touchdowns have always been hit or miss for him. JuJu, on the other hand, 5 catches for 84 yards on 8 targets. That's not what you're hoping for when you drafted either of these two guys. But again, the hope would be is that Thomas stays afloat, JuJu doesn't lose too much, and again, we'll see how the backfield sort of operates.
I want to ask you this. So do they become number 2 receivers?
Oh, well, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Thomas is going to be a guy that until you get Drew Brees back, you have to sort of downgrade the expectations. But if it's 10 for 89, you're starting him without hesitation.
10 for 89 and a touchdown, he's
a star.
Right.
Absolute star. And then JuJu 5 for 84, it's kind of where he was a year ago.
If it's 5 for 84 and a touchdown, then it's...
Oh, of course.
Right.
And again, it's, the examples that we look at is T.Y. Hilton was a huge loser in 2017 when Andrew Luck was lost for the season. Antonio Brown has really struggled during his Pittsburgh tenure when he didn't have Ben Roethlisberger. Yesterday was actually the first time Brown actually caught a touchdown from somebody not named Roethlisberger. So keeping an eye on these injury situations as well.